A billionaire abandoned his pregnant wife for his mistress, only to discover 5 years later that his ex-wife had given birth to twins who were now heirs to his rival's fortune. His mistress turned out to be working for his business competitor, making his betrayal both personal and professional. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The penthouse suite shimmered, a testament to Julian Thorne's vast wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a cold light on Isabella's swollen belly, highlighting the stark contrast between the opulent surroundings and the fragile beauty of his pregnant wife. He sat across from her, a half-empty glass of amber liquid swirling in his hand, the ice clinking a discordant rhythm to the silent tension hanging between them. "It's complicated," Julian mumbled, his voice rough. He avoided her gaze, the polished mahogany table a shield between them. The air hung heavy with unspoken accusations. Isabella's fingers traced the delicate curve of her burgeoning stomach, a silent plea. Her eyes, usually sparkling with a vibrant energy, were now clouded with a profound sadness. "Complicated? Julian, you're leaving me." Her voice was barely a whisper, each word a tiny shard of glass piercing his heart. Or at least what little of it remained accessible. He shifted uncomfortably. "It's not like that. It's Serafina." The name tasted like ash in his mouth. He knew it was a pathetic excuse, a flimsy justification for his self-serving desires. Isabella's silence was deafening. The only sound was the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hall, each second a hammer blow against the fragile edifice of their marriage. She finally lifted her gaze, her eyes pools of unshed tears. "Serafina?" she repeated, the name a bitter curse on her lips. "She's ambitious." The single word carried the weight of betrayal, of a future stolen, of a life shattered. A tear escaped, tracing a shimmering path down her cheek. Julian watched it fall, a silent acknowledgement of his culpability. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer a hollow apology, but the words caught in his throat. The opulence of the penthouse, the shimmering city lights sprawling outside the window, none of it mattered now. Only the devastation in Isabella's eyes, the quiet tragedy unfolding before him, mattered. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, crushing him beneath the immensity of his selfishness. His gilded cage had become a prison. The sterile scent of antiseptic battled the faint sweetness of lilies in the small, sparsely furnished hospital room. Isabella, pale but resolute, cradled her newborn twins. One, a tiny replica of Julian with his dark hair and striking eyes, slept soundly. The other, a miniature version of Isabella, with her mother's gentle features and fiery red hair, stirred, letting out a tiny whimper. The exhaustion etched on Isabella's face belied a quiet strength, a fierce protectiveness that radiated from her. A single tear traced a path through the faint dusting of powder on her cheek. The joy was undeniable, yet shadowed by the bitter absence. Julian's betrayal hung over her like a storm cloud, dimming the brilliance of this momentous occasion. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. Isabella, with the unwavering support of her family, found a rhythm to her new life, a life far removed from the gilded cage of Julian's penthouse. She found solace in the simple pleasures, the gurgle of her son's laughter, the warmth of her sister's embrace, the familiar comfort of her childhood home. The city lights, once a symbol of her lost paradise, now held little allure. Her focus was solely on her children, two tiny beings who demanded and received all of her love. The memory of Julian's cold words still stung, a constant reminder of the pain he had inflicted, but it no longer held the power to consume her. She had found a strength within herself, a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. The quiet dignity with which she carried herself spoke volumes, a silent testament to the triumph of the human spirit over adversity. 5 years passed, leaving behind a trail of both heartache and unexpected growth. The mahogany desk, polished to a mirror sheen, reflected Julian's haggard face. 5 years. 5 years since he'd walked away, leaving Isabella alone, pregnant, heartbroken. The scent of old leather and expensive cigars, usually a comfort, now felt suffocating. His phone buzzed, a cryptic message from his lawyer. Blackwood's will. Twins. Heirs. The words slammed into him, a physical blow. His breath hitched. Twins? His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of guilt and disbelief. He slammed his fist on the desk, the sound echoing in the cavernous silence of his office. He'd built this empire, brick by agonizing brick, fueled by ambition and ruthlessness. And now the foundation crumbled beneath him. He hadn't seen Isabella since that night, 5 years ago, but her face, etched with sorrow and betrayal, haunted him. The lawyer's words replayed in his mind. Substantial portion of Blackwood's holdings? Unexpected beneficiaries. Blackwood, his arch-rival, had left his sons his fortune? A cruel twist of fate, or a divine intervention? The thought of 2 small boys, his sons, inheriting his competitor's empire while he struggled against financial ruin, sent a wave of nausea through him. He needed to find them, needed to understand. This wasn't just a business setback. It was a personal reckoning. The weight of his choices, his callous disregard for Isabella and the life he'd destroyed, crashed down upon him with the force of a tidal wave. He was drowning in a sea of his own making. The opulent surroundings, once a symbol of his success, mocked his downfall. The expensive art on the walls seemed to sneer, judging his self-destructive choices. He needed to see Isabella, needed to face the consequences of his actions. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling. The number was etched in his memory, a ghost from a past he desperately wanted to undo. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windows of Julian's penthouse. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clinking a discordant rhythm against the turmoil in his chest. The lawyer's words echoed, substantial portion, unexpected beneficiaries. His reflection, a gaunt, older version of the man he once was, stared back. The champagne tasted like ash. He thought of Isabella's face, the soft curve of her cheek, the way her eyes, once bright with laughter, now held a haunting sadness he'd inflicted. The memory was a physical ache, a constant reminder of his betrayal. He justified his actions then, weaving a tapestry of ambition and self-deception. Now the threads frayed, revealing the ugly truth. His phone vibrated again, a text from his assistant, a bland update on the Blackwood situation. He ignored it, the sleek, minimalist design of the device feeling ironically cold and distant in his grip. He needed something more visceral, a connection to the reality of his actions, beyond legal documents and business reports. He rose, the plush carpet muffling his steps as he moved to the balcony. The city sprawled beneath him, a glittering tapestry of lights and shadows, yet it offered no solace. The wind whipped at his expensive suit, a chilling counterpoint to the expensive scotch warming nothing within him. A single tear traced a path down his cheek, a stark contrast to the carefully sculpted facade he presented to the world. He whispered, the words lost to the wind and the city's roar, "What have I done?" He closed his eyes, the image of Isabella's face, pregnant and vulnerable, sharper than any business deal, any financial report. The guilt clawed at him, raw and relentless. He had not only abandoned her, but condemned his children to a life he couldn't comprehend, a life shaped by his selfish choices. The twins, his sons, were his responsibility. He had to find them. He turned away from the city, its dazzling lights suddenly insignificant compared to the darkness within. The weight of his responsibility, a crushing burden, settled heavily on his shoulders. He knew the journey to redemption wouldn't be easy, that it would require more than money or power to atone for his past. It would demand humility, a quality he had lacked for far too long. He picked up the phone, his hand steadier now, his voice resolving to reach a strength he wasn't certain he possessed, and dialed Isabella's number. The line rang, each ring a hammer blow against the fragile walls of his carefully constructed world. He held his breath. The call went straight to voicemail. Julian stared at the phone, the sleek surface reflecting his grim face. The city lights, once a symbol of his success, now mocked him with their indifferent brilliance. He slammed the phone onto the mahogany desk, the sharp sound echoing the turmoil within him. The scent of expensive scotch, usually a comfort, now stung his nostrils, a bitter reminder of the numbed existence he'd cultivated. He poured another drink, his hand trembling slightly. The ice clinked against the glass, a jarring counterpoint to the silence that pressed in on him, suffocating. He needed to see Isabella, to hear her voice, even if it was laced with the venom of righteous anger. He needed to understand the consequences of his actions, to confront the reality of his betrayal, not in the cold light of a legal document, but in the raw, visceral intensity of her presence. He pictured her soft smile, the way her eyes had once held the promise of a shared future, a future he'd shattered with his reckless ambition. The image ignited a fire in his gut, a searing blend of guilt and a desperate longing he hadn't allowed himself to feel until now. 5 years. 5 years of self-deception. 5 years of building a life based on a lie. He paced the length of the opulent living room, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. His penthouse, once a symbol of his power and success, felt like a gilded cage, trapping him in his self-made prison of regret. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture revealing the strain etched onto his features. He looked older, wearier, the sharp edges of his youthful arrogance softened by a growing awareness of his profound mistakes. The phone rang. His assistant. He picked up, his voice tight with contained emotion. "Yes, Sarah? Mr. Thorne, there's been a development. Mr. Blackwood's lawyers called. They seem to know about the twins." A cold dread, sharper than any blade, pierced through Julian. Blackwood, the rival he'd so carelessly underestimated. The man who now held the key to his redemption or his utter ruin. The weight of his actions, the consequences of his choices, pressed down on him heavy and inescapable. The game had shifted, and Julian Thorne, the billionaire, found himself utterly unprepared for the stakes. The battle was far from over. It had only just begun. The news hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Sarah's voice, usually crisp and efficient, was laced with a tremor Julian hadn't noticed before. Blackwood knew about the twins. The mahogany desk, usually a symbol of his control, felt suddenly unstable beneath his trembling hands. He pushed away from it, the leather groaning a silent protest. The city lights blurred through the panoramic window, a dizzying kaleidoscope of color and indifference. He paced, the plush carpet whispering beneath his feet, a futile attempt to silence the storm raging inside. 5 years. 5 years of opulent solitude, fueled by self-deception and cheap thrills. 5 years since he'd last seen Isabella's face, a face now etched in his memory, a haunting reminder of his colossal mistake. The scent of expensive cigars, usually a comforting ritual, now felt like a choking cloud of regret. He pictured her, serene yet strong, raising his sons in a quiet haven far from his gilded cage. A sharp pang of guilt pierced through the numbness, a raw, visceral ache. He hadn't even known. He'd built his life on a foundation of lies, a magnificent edifice perched precariously on a bed of shattered trust. The phone rang again, jarring him from his self-absorbed reverie. He hesitated, the sharp metallic tang of fear coating his tongue. It was Isabella's number. His heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Not yet. He needed to gather himself, to prepare for the storm that was surely brewing. He needed to face the consequences, not as the arrogant billionaire, but as the man he truly was, a man stripped bare of his illusions, exposed in the harsh light of his own betrayal. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a crushing burden that threatened to suffocate him. The battle had begun, and this time the stakes were far higher than any business deal. The future of his family, his redemption, his very soul hung precariously in the balance. The silence in his penthouse was a suffocating blanket. Julian stared at the city, a million pinpricks of light mocking his inner darkness. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the scent of expensive scotch doing little to soothe the turmoil within. His phone lay beside him, Isabella's unanswered call a stark reminder of his cowardice. He thought of her, the ghost of her smile haunting his memories, the soft curve of her cheek, the way her laughter used to fill his empty spaces. He'd replaced those spaces with fleeting pleasures, hollow victories that now felt like ash in his mouth. The regret was a physical weight, crushing him beneath its burden. A knock at the door jolted him. His assistant, Sarah, stood in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Blackwood, he wants to meet. Tonight." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken threats. Blackwood, the man who now held the keys to his son's future, the man who had orchestrated his downfall. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the numbness. But beneath the fear, a flicker of something else ignited defiance. He wouldn't cower. Not this time. "Tell him," Julian said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I'll be there." He took a deep breath, the sharp tang of the scotch momentarily clearing his head. He would face Blackwood, face Isabella, face the consequences of his actions. He had to, for his sons, for himself. The battle had begun, and he wouldn't surrender without a fight. The fight for his redemption. The mahogany door of Blackwood's office felt heavy, symbolic of the weight-crushing Julian. The air hung thick with the scent of old leather and expensive cigars, a stark contrast to the sterile scent of his own penthouse. Blackwood, a man built like a granite cliff, sat behind a desk that could house a small car. His smile was thin, cruel. "Thorne." Blackwood's voice was a low growl. 5 years. 5 years you've danced on the edge of my empire, and now you're here, begging for scraps. Julian met his gaze, refusing to flinch. "My sons," he began, the words catching in his throat. "Their inheritance." Blackwood chuckled, a harsh sound that echoed in the cavernous room. "Ah yes, the little princes. A convenient pawn, wouldn't you say?" He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "I've been rather amused, watching you unravel." "I want to make amends," Julian said, his voice low but firm. The words tasted like ash, but he forced them out. "For everything." Blackwood studied him, his eyes narrowed. "Amends? You think a few apologies will erase what you've done? You destroyed Isabella, stole her happiness, and now you want to play the repentant father." The sting of Blackwood's words was sharp, but Julian stood his ground. The image of Isabella's face, etched with sorrow, flashed before his eyes. "I was a fool," he admitted, the confession raw and painful. "Blind, selfish, but I've seen the error of my ways." He watched as a flicker of something akin to surprise crossed Blackwood's face. A calculation, perhaps, then a cold smile. "Very well, Thorne. Let's see how genuine this repentance truly is. There's a price for everything, you understand?" The implication hung heavy in the air, a chilling promise of more pain to come. Julian knew this was only the beginning of his long, arduous climb towards redemption. The battle, he realized with a sickening lurch, was far from over. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Isabella's small, sun-drenched apartment, a stark contrast to the opulent perfume that once filled Julian's penthouse. 5 years. 5 years since he'd abandoned her, leaving her with the crushing weight of his betrayal and the burgeoning life within her. Now, cradling a newborn, she'd found a different kind of opulence, the quiet joy of motherhood, a warmth that no amount of money could ever buy. The twins, Matteo and Lucas, gurgled contentedly in their cribs, their tiny fists clenching and unclenching. A photograph on the mantelpiece, slightly faded but precious, showed a younger Isabella, her eyes bright with a love Julian had so carelessly discarded. A soft knock on the door startled her. Hesitantly, she opened it to reveal her sister, Sophia, her face etched with worry. "He's here, I say," Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible above the twins' cooing. "Julian." Isabella's breath hitched. The name felt alien, a painful reminder of a past she tried so hard to bury. She felt a familiar tightness in her chest, a mixture of fear and a deep-seated resentment. The years hadn't dulled the sting of his abandonment. "He's asking to see the boys," Sophia continued, her eyes pleading. He says he's changed. Isabella stared at her sister, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. The image of Matteo and Lucas' innocent faces filled her mind, a wave of protective love washing over her. Should she allow Julian, the man who had shattered her world, to see them? The thought was terrifying, yet a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of hope ignited within her. A hope that perhaps, maybe, some part of the man she once knew still existed. The decision hung heavy, a silent battle waged within her heart. The scent of lilies from a nearby vase, usually a comforting aroma, now felt suffocating, mirroring the turmoil within her. The twins' gurgles seemed to echo the silent question hanging in the air. Could forgiveness ever truly bloom in the shadow of such deep betrayal? The afternoon sun slanted through the gaps in the blinds, casting long shadows across the worn rug. Dust motes danced in the golden light, a silent testament to Isabella's quiet, solitary life. She held Matteo close, his small body warm against hers, his rhythmic breathing a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil within. The lilies, their fragrance usually comforting, now felt cloying, a heavy perfume mirroring the weight of her decision. Sophia's words echoed in her ears. He says he's changed. Changed? The word felt hollow, a cruel joke whispered on the wind. 5 years of carefully constructed silence. 5 years of rebuilding her life brick by painful brick, threatened to crumble under the weight of Julian's unexpected reappearance. A tear traced a path down her cheek, hot and silent. She brushed it away, her touch lingering on Matteo's soft skin. Looking down at her son's peaceful face, she felt a surge of fierce protectiveness, a primal instinct stronger than any lingering resentment. A knock, softer this time. Isabella hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the door. The twins stirred, their gurgles a fragile melody in the sudden silence. She took a deep breath, the scent of lilies momentarily forgotten in the face of this looming confrontation. Opening the door, she saw Julian standing on the threshold, his expensive suit a jarring contrast to the simple, worn hallway. His face, etched with a weariness she hadn't expected, held a hint of, was it hope? Or was it just another carefully crafted facade? Isabella, he began, his voice a low murmur, a shadow of the confident baritone she remembered. The words hung heavy in the air, thick with unspoken apologies and years of regret. I need to see them. His gaze flickered towards the sleeping twins, a raw vulnerability replacing the arrogant assurance she'd once known. The weight of his request hung between them, a tangible thing, heavy with the unspoken history that separated them. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the suffocating silence. The decision, she realized, was no longer just hers. It was Matteo's and Lucas. It was a decision about their future, their right to know their father, despite the man he had been. The tiny apartment, smelling faintly of lavender and stale milk, felt cramped under the weight of Julian's presence. Isabella, clutching Matteo tighter, felt a familiar tremor of anxiety. The afternoon sun, filtering through the lace curtains, illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, a poignant symbol of time's relentless march. 5 years. 5 years of silence, punctuated only by the soft sounds of her son's breathing. I need to see them, Julian repeated, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were now shadowed with a weariness that bordered on desperation. The expensive suit, a stark contrast to the simplicity of her life, seemed to amplify his discomfort. Isabella's gaze drifted to the sleeping twins. Matteo, his cheek pressed against her breast, breathed evenly. Lucas, nestled in his crib, stirred slightly, his tiny hand reaching out. The sight of them, so vulnerable, so utterly dependent, ignited a fierce protectiveness within her. "They're sleeping," she said, her voice barely a whisper, each word carefully chosen, a defense against the tidal wave of emotion threatening to overwhelm her. The scent of lilies, usually a comfort, now felt suffocating, a stark reminder of the opulent life she'd left behind. Julian shifted uncomfortably, his expensive shoes scuffing against the worn linoleum. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken accusations and years of regret. The weight of his betrayal hung heavy in the air, a tangible presence that neither of them could ignore. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I understand if you don't want me to." He paused, his gaze searching hers, desperate for understanding, for forgiveness. He looked smaller, somehow shrunken by the weight of his past actions. The arrogant billionaire seemed to have vanished, replaced by a man humbled by regret. Isabella studied him, her heart a battlefield of conflicting emotions. The pain, the anger, the betrayal, they were still raw, still vivid. But something else was there, too. A flicker of pity? Or perhaps something more profound? A ghost of the man she'd once loved, buried beneath layers of hurt and deceit? The decision, she realized, wasn't simply about forgiveness. It was about the future, about the lives of her sons, about her own capacity for healing. The lilies remained, a silent witness to this delicate dance between the past and the future. The air thrummed with unspoken words, with unfulfilled promises, with the raw, brutal honesty of a life irrevocably changed. The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and frantic feeds. Isabella, fueled by an almost superhuman strength, navigated the exhausting demands of motherhood. The tiny apartment, though humble, pulsed with a quiet, fierce love. The twins, Matteo and Lucas, were a constant source of wonder and worry. Their laughter, tiny gurgles, and the weight of their small bodies in her arms were her solace. Financially, things were tight. Her family helped where they could, but their resources were limited. Yet, a strange sense of peace settled over her. A freedom, even. She'd escaped the gilded cage of her marriage, trading opulence for a quiet, if sometimes precarious, independence. One blustery November evening, a tiny cry pierced the stillness. Lucas, normally a placid infant, was inconsolable. Isabella, exhausted but determined, held him close, her heart aching with the weight of her loneliness. The rhythmic motion of rocking him soothed her as much as it did him. Through the window, rain lashed against the panes, mimicking the storm raging inside her. The scent of lavender from her homemade lotion mingled with the damp chill of the room. The memory of Julian's cologne, sharp, masculine, and utterly alien, now briefly surfaced, only to be swiftly buried under the wave of maternal protectiveness. She hummed a lullaby, a melody learned from her grandmother, a tune that spoke of resilience and hope. As the minutes ticked by and Lucas finally drifted off to sleep, a profound sense of gratitude washed over her. He was hers. Matteo was hers. These two tiny lives, born from pain, were her triumph. They were her future. She looked down at the sleeping twins, her eyes welling up, not with sorrow, but with a quiet, fierce pride. The lilies Julian had showered her with before his departure seemed a lifetime ago, replaced by the humble but potent scent of lavender and the quiet strength of her own self-sufficiency. The struggle was real, the path ahead uncertain. But tonight, at least, the storm had passed, leaving behind the promise of a new dawn. 5 years. 5 years of whispered lullabies, scraped knees kissed better, and the constant, comforting weight of tiny hands in hers. Isabella's apartment, though small, felt vast with the echoes of their laughter. Sunlight streamed through the lace-curtained window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a silent testament to the quiet rhythm of her life. Matteo, a whirlwind of energy, was building a precarious tower of blocks, his brow furrowed in concentration. Lucas, quieter, more contemplative, sat beside him, meticulously arranging a collection of colorful pebbles. The scent of baking bread filled the air, a comforting aroma that always seemed to soothe the anxieties that still occasionally surfaced. Isabella hummed softly, a melody as familiar as her own heartbeat. As she kneaded dough, her movements fluid and practiced. The rhythmic motion was a balm, a quiet ritual that grounded her in the present. A knock at the door startled her. Hesitantly, She opened it to reveal a woman she barely recognized, yet whose face held a strange, unsettling familiarity. Serafina. Years had softened her sharp edges, but the calculating glint in her eyes remained. "Isabella," Serafina began, her voice a carefully modulated whisper. I need to talk to you." The words hung heavy in the air, laced with an unspoken plea. Isabella felt a chill despite the warmth of the kitchen. She'd never truly forgiven Serafina, yet a flicker of morbid curiosity flickered within her. "About what?" Isabella asked, her voice guarded. She gestured to the two chairs near the table, inviting Serafina in. The aroma of baking bread seemed to war with the unsettling scent of expensive perfume clinging to Serafina, a stark reminder of their contrasting lives. The years had given Isabella a quiet strength, a resilience that radiated from her, a quiet contrast to Serafina's strained composure. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken accusations and regrets, the air heavy with the weight of betrayal and unspoken consequences. Isabella's gaze drifted to her sons, their absorbed play a stark contrast to the drama unfolding before them. The subtle scent of lavender lotion lingered in the air, a testament to the life Isabella had painstakingly rebuilt, far from the gilded cage of her past. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the worn wooden floorboards of Isabella's kitchen. Dust motes danced in the golden light, illuminating the quiet chaos of toys scattered around Matteo and Lucas. 5 years. 5 years since Julian's callous departure. 5 years since she'd last seen Serafina. The scent of baking bread, a comforting ritual, warred with the unexpected perfume clinging to Serafina, a ghost from a life she'd left behind. Serafina's presence felt like a violation, a jarring dissonance in the peaceful melody of her life. Isabella, however, found a strange strength within herself, a resilience born from years of quiet struggle. She offered Serafina a chair, the movement precise and controlled, betraying none of the turmoil within. "I need your help," Serafina whispered, her voice tight with unspoken desperation. The sharp edges of her ambition had been softened by time, replaced by a vulnerability that both intrigued and unsettled Isabella. Years hadn't erased the hurt, but they had, perhaps, cracked open a space for something else. Isabella's eyes, once clouded with despair, now held a quiet strength. She studied Serafina, searching for the truth behind the carefully constructed facade. "Help with what?" Her voice was even, calm, betraying nothing of the carefully constructed wall she'd built around her heart. "Julian, he's in trouble," Serafina stammered, her carefully composed demeanor crumbling. "He doesn't know about the boys. He needs to know." The confession hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years of deceit and unspoken regrets. A single tear traced a path down Serafina's cheek, a testament to the burden she carried. Isabella's gaze shifted to her sons, their carefree play a stark contrast to the gravity of the situation. The rhythmic kneading of the dough became more frantic, a physical manifestation of the internal struggle within. The warm, yeasty aroma suddenly felt suffocating. The years had been hard, but they had also gifted her a quiet dignity, a strength she never knew she possessed. The decision weighed heavily on her, a choice between the past and the fragile peace she'd so carefully constructed. The silence stretched, filled only with the soft sounds of her son's play and the rhythmic thud of her hands against the dough. Her breath hitched. This wasn't just about Julian anymore. It was about her sons, and she had to decide what that meant. The weight of Serafina's confession hung heavy in the air, thick and cloying like the scent of overripe plums. Isabella kneaded the dough with a fierce intensity, the rhythmic thud a counterpoint to the frantic beat of her heart. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden beams, a silent ballet of forgotten moments. 5 years. 5 years of carefully constructed silence, of quiet dignity, of fiercely guarded peace. And now this, "He doesn't know," Serafina repeated, her voice a fragile whisper lost in the hum of the refrigerator. Tears streamed down her face, marring the carefully applied makeup, revealing a vulnerability Isabella hadn't seen before. The woman before her, the ambitious mistress, seemed a distant memory. Isabella stopped kneading. The dough, warm and yielding, felt strangely cold in her hands. She looked at her sons, Matteo and Lucas, absorbed in their playful world, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. Their innocent laughter was a cruel irony, a stark contrast to the bitter taste of betrayal that lingered on her tongue. "He needs to know," Serafina pleaded, her voice thick with unshed tears, about the boys, about their inheritance." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken consequences. The quiet hum of the refrigerator seemed to mock the turmoil within Isabella. Isabella's gaze drifted to the framed photographs on the mantelpiece, pictures of a happier time, a life she'd painstakingly rebuilt from the ashes of her shattered past. The image of Julian, his face frozen in a moment of fleeting happiness, brought a sharp pang of something akin to pity. "Why?" Isabella finally asked, her voice barely a breath. The question was less about the revelation itself and more about the motivations behind it. Was this remorse? A desperate attempt at redemption? Or something else entirely? Serafina's shoulders slumped. "Blackwood, he's using me. He wants to destroy Julian. But I can't stand by and watch him hurt them," she choked out, her words tumbling over each other in a rush of confession. The confession was a confession of her own complicity, her own betrayal, a mirror reflecting Isabella's own pain. The silence stretched, broken only by the soft sounds of the children's play and the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. The decision weighed on Isabella, heavy and inescapable. It was a choice not just about Julian, but about the future of her sons, a future she had so painstakingly created, a future she would fiercely protect. The scent of baking bread, once comforting, now felt suffocating, a symbol of a life both precious and fragile. The afternoon sun, once a source of warmth, now seemed to cast long, accusing shadows across the room. 5 years. 5 years since the echoing silence of Julian's departure, replaced by the gentle rhythm of twin breaths, the soft patter of tiny feet. Isabella traced the worn edges of a photograph, a smiling Julian, a radiant Isabella, a burgeoning belly promising a future stolen before it bloomed. The scent of lavender, a faint ghost of her pre-betrayal life, clung to the aged paper. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across her meticulously tended garden, a vibrant tapestry of color against the backdrop of her modest but charming cottage. The doorbell's chimes sliced through her reverie, sharp and unexpected. A nervous Serafina stood on the porch, her usual composure shattered. Her usually perfect makeup was smudged, her expensive dress rumpled, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. The transformation was startling, revealing a vulnerability Isabella had never witnessed in the calculating mistress. "Isabella," Serafina began, her voice barely a whisper, "I need to tell you something." The words tumbled out, a torrent of guilt and fear. "It's about Julian and the boys." Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden silence. She gestured Serafina inside, the scent of baking bread momentarily overpowering the lingering lavender. Matteo and Lucas, oblivious to the impending storm, were engrossed in a game of building blocks, their small hands meticulously stacking colorful cubes. Their innocent laughter was a cruel juxtaposition to the gravity of the situation. "He doesn't know," Serafina confessed, her voice cracking. "He doesn't know about the inheritance." The words hung heavy in the air, thick with unspoken implications. Blackwood's name, a whisper of venomous intent, slithered into the conversation, painting a picture of calculated betrayal, a chess game played with human lives as pawns. Isabella's gaze shifted to her sons, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the afternoon sun. A chilling realization dawned: the quiet life she'd painstakingly built, the fragile peace she'd fiercely protected, was about to be shattered. The weight of this new revelation pressed down on her, heavy and inescapable. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, a constant backdrop to their hushed conversation, seemed to mock her internal turmoil. 5 years of silent strength, of carefully constructed resilience, were about to be tested. This wasn't just about Julian's betrayal. It was about the future of her sons, a future she would fight tooth and nail to protect. The mahogany desk felt cold beneath Julian's trembling hands. The lawyer's words echoed in the opulent, yet suddenly claustrophobic, office. Twins, Marcus Blackwood's fortune. Your sons. The crisp scent of expensive leather couldn't mask the metallic tang of panic rising in Julian's throat. He stared at the stark legal documents, the black ink blurring through a sudden sheen of tears. 5 years. 5 years of self-satisfied oblivion, shattered in a single devastating sentence. Guilt, a venomous serpent, coiled in his gut. He'd abandoned Isabella, a woman he'd once vowed to love, leaving her to face the terrifying ordeal of motherhood alone. Now, his sons, his flesh and blood, were flourishing in a life he'd actively rejected. The city outside, a glittering spectacle of ambition and power, seemed to mock his desolation. He pictured Isabella, her quiet strength, a stark contrast to his own flailing ego. The image of her, holding 2 tiny babies, her eyes reflecting a love that had somehow persevered, pierced him with unbearable remorse. He had to see them. He had to atone, however impossible that might seem. He drove to her address, the sleek lines of his car a grotesque symbol of his ill-gotten wealth. The cottage, nestled amidst a riot of color in her garden, was a picture of serene domesticity, a painful reminder of the peace he'd destroyed. He hesitated, hand hovering over the doorbell, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. The chime sound was a tiny explosion of anxiety in the stillness. Isabella opened the door, her face etched with a quiet dignity that both wounded and awed him. Her eyes, once bright with love, now held a glacial reserve. "Julian," she said, the name a mere breath, devoid of warmth. He wanted to apologize, to explain, but the words caught in his throat. 2 small boys, their faces alight with curiosity, peeked from behind her legs. His sons. The resemblance was undeniable, a mirror reflecting his own features, his own flaws. The scent of lavender, a memory he'd thought buried, hung in the air, a bittersweet reminder of a life he'd carelessly thrown away. He felt his carefully constructed composure crumble under the weight of her silent judgment. He opened his mouth to speak, but all that escaped were ragged breaths, the sound of a man facing the wreckage of his own creation. The silence stretched, taut and unforgiving, filled only with the faint hum of the refrigerator and the unspoken accusations hanging heavy in the air. He knew, in that moment, that this was merely the beginning of a long, arduous journey towards a redemption he might not deserve. The cottage smelled of lavender and freshly baked bread, a stark contrast to the sterile scent of Julian's penthouse. He shifted uncomfortably, the expensive fabric of his suit feeling alien against his skin. Isabella's silence was a physical weight, heavier than any accusation. The twins, Leo and Finn, identical in their dark hair and curious eyes, peered from behind her legs, their small hands clutching her dress. "They're remarkable," Julian finally managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. The words felt inadequate, pathetic in the face of the years of hurt he'd inflicted. Isabella's gaze, cool and assessing, swept over him. "Remarkable," she echoed, the word laced with icy sarcasm. "They're also healthy and happy, Julian. Something you seem to have forgotten how to cultivate." The quiet steel in her voice was far more damaging than any outburst. Leo, bolder than his brother, stepped forward, his small hand reaching out tentatively. Julian's heart lurched. He knelt, careful not to startle the child, his own breath catching in his throat. The boy's touch was surprisingly firm, a tiny hand gripping his finger with surprising strength. Finn, however, remained hidden, his face buried in his mother's skirt. A pang of something akin to longing stabbed at Julian. This was his family, his legacy, a legacy he'd almost destroyed. I want to be a part of their lives," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. The words were a fragile bridge, offered across a chasm of pain and betrayal. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, heavy and unforgiving. He could almost feel the silent judgment of his sons, their small bodies radiating an unspoken awareness of his absence. Isabella's gaze softened, ever so slightly, but the frost hadn't entirely melted. "That," she said, her voice still measured, "remains to be seen, Julian. Actions speak louder than words." She glanced at her sons, then back at Julian, a hint of something unreadable flickering in her eyes, a flicker of hope, perhaps, or just a calculating assessment of his sincerity. The uncertainty hung in the air, as thick and heavy as the lavender scent clinging to the curtains. The scene ended on a note of precarious balance, a moment poised between destruction and possible redemption. The news hit Julian like a physical blow. Marcus Blackwood, his nemesis, his rival, had died unexpectedly, leaving his entire fortune, a staggering sum, to two previously unknown heirs, 5-year-old twins. The lawyer's clipped words echoed in the cavernous silence of Julian's office, the polished mahogany desk suddenly feeling cold and alien beneath his trembling hands. He stared at the photograph, a grainy image showing Isabella, younger, brighter, holding 2 identical babies. His babies. A wave of nausea washed over him, the opulent surroundings blurring into a nauseating haze. The guilt, a familiar companion, intensified, sharpening the edges of his self-loathing. He slammed his fist on the desk, the sound oddly satisfying in its brutality. 5 years. 5 years he'd spent chasing shadows, indulging in a self-serving delusion of happiness with Serafina, while Isabella, his wife, had silently carried his children, alone and heartbroken. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, crushing him under the weight of his own self-inflicted misery. He felt a dull ache behind his eyes, a physical manifestation of his regret. The image of Isabella's face, etched with a quiet dignity that had always both captivated and intimidated him, flickered in his mind. He saw the soft curve of her cheek, the slight tremor in her chin, the way her eyes, once so full of life and love, now held a guarded distance. The memory of her touch, the scent of her skin, was a phantom limb, a constant reminder of what he'd thrown away. He needed to see her, to see them, his sons. The need clawed at him, desperate and raw. He had to make amends, even if it was too late. The phone felt heavy in his hand as he dialed her number, each ring a hammer blow against the fragile hope budding within him. The phone rang, a shrill, insistent sound in the otherwise silent room. His breath hitched in his chest as a hesitant voice answered. It was Isabella. Her voice, though calm, held an undercurrent of steel. He could almost hear the years of hurt weighing down each syllable. He cleared his throat, his voice raspy and uncharacteristically hesitant. "Isabella," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "It's Julian." The silence that followed was filled with unspoken accusations, unspoken pain. The future hung precariously in the balance. The lawyer's words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Julian felt the plush leather of his chair suddenly rough against his skin, the opulent office a gilded cage. He stared at the photograph, the grainy image of Isabella, younger, her eyes brimming with a light he'd extinguished. Guilt, a cold fist, clenched around his heart. He'd built an empire, yet it crumbled before the revelation of his sons. He pictured Isabella, alone, bearing his children, her quiet dignity a stark contrast to his selfish pursuit of fleeting pleasure. The scent of her lavender perfume, a memory as sharp as a shard of glass, pierced the suffocating luxury. The weight of his abandonment pressed down, a crushing burden. The phone call was a plunge into the icy depths of his regret. Isabella's voice, a calm counterpoint to the storm raging within him, held a glacial reserve. "Isabella," he began, his voice a raspy whisper. "It's Julian." Silence, heavy and pregnant with unspoken accusations. He could hear her breath, shallow, controlled, a testament to the years of hurt he'd inflicted. "I know," she finally said, her voice even, devoid of emotion, yet carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. He swallowed, the dryness in his throat mirroring the emptiness in his soul. I want to see them. The words felt clumsy, inadequate, a pathetic attempt to bridge the chasm he'd created. They are not your playthings, Julian. Her voice sharpened, a hint of steel piercing the calm. They've known nothing but a father's absence. You had your chance, and you threw it away. The words were like blows, each one landing with brutal precision. He flinched, the sharp edge of her rejection cutting through his carefully constructed armor of self-justification. He had expected anger, but this cold detachment was worse, a reflection of his own failure. The silence stretched, broken only by the hum of the expensive air conditioning, a mocking soundtrack to his despair. He felt the prickle of unshed tears behind his eyes, a desperate plea for forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. "I know," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I know." The line went dead, leaving him alone in the echoing silence of his opulent prison. The following week, Julian drove to Isabella's modest home, a stark contrast to his glass and steel tower. The air smelled of freshly baked bread and something faintly floral, a comforting aroma worlds away from the sterile scent of his office. He sat nervously in his car, the engine ticking a relentless rhythm against the quiet hum of the neighborhood. He watched children playing hopscotch on the cracked pavement, their carefree laughter a painful reminder of his own missed opportunities. Taking a deep breath, he finally got out of the car, his expensive suit feeling out of place amid the ordinary beauty of the street. He rang the doorbell, the sound echoing oddly loud in the stillness. The door opened cautiously, revealing Isabella. She hadn't aged as much as he expected, her beauty refined by a quiet strength. But her eyes, once bright and sparkling, held a cautious reserve that chilled him to the bone. "Julian," she said, her voice even devoid of warmth. "What do you want?" He swallowed, the words catching in his throat. I want to see the boys." "They're not on display, Julian," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "And I don't believe you have the right to just show up." Her voice, although calm, held a steely undertone that spoke volumes about her 5 years of pain. He saw a flicker of something, perhaps sadness, perhaps pity in her eyes, and a desperate plea rose in his throat. "I know I hurt you, Isabella. He couldn't continue. The words seemed inadequate, pathetic. He gestured helplessly towards the quiet street, the carefree children. "I want to be a part of their lives." Isabella didn't answer immediately. She looked at him, her expression unreadable, then at the children playing a safe distance away. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken accusations and years of pent-up hurt. Finally, she sighed, a sound heavy with weariness. "Come in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But don't expect miracles, Julian. It's going to take a lot more than a visit to earn their trust or mine." She stepped aside, allowing him into the small, lovingly lived-in house, the scent of baking bread and lavender stronger now, a comforting aroma, yet laced with a melancholy he recognized as his own. The living room, small but bright, felt strangely intimate. Sunlight streamed through lace-curtained windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The scent of lavender, stronger now, mingled with the lingering sweetness of baked bread, a comforting domesticity that contrasted sharply with Julian's usual sterile environment. Isabella offered him a seat, a worn armchair that seemed to have absorbed the weight of years. He sat stiffly, his expensive suit a jarring note in the room's quiet charm. His sons, 5-year-old twins, were building a magnificent castle out of blocks in a corner, their quiet concentration punctuated by the occasional excited murmur. Julian watched them, a pang of something unfamiliar, perhaps longing, perhaps regret, twisting in his gut. They were strikingly similar, their dark hair mirroring Isabella's, their eyes possessing the same spark he remembered, but now tempered with a wisdom beyond their years. They're beautiful," he managed, his voice rough, the words feeling inadequate, clumsy. Isabella didn't respond immediately. She simply watched him, her eyes betraying nothing, a guardedness that mirrored the fortress her sons were constructing. The silence hung heavy, thick with unspoken resentments, with years of hurt and betrayal. "They're resilient," she finally said, her voice soft, but the tone unwavering. "They've learned to build their own castles." Julian shifted uncomfortably. He wanted to reach out to them, to touch their hair, to offer a clumsy apology, but he hesitated, unsure if he deserved such closeness. He knew he had to prove his worth. It wouldn't be easy. Isabella's words were a challenge, an invitation, but also a warning. He looked at the twins again, at their absorbed focus, their quiet determination. He saw not just a reflection of Isabella's strength, but a glimpse of his own lost potential, a reflection of the father he could have been. A wave of self-loathing washed over him, bitter and unrelenting. He had thrown away this family, this simple, comforting life, for an illusion, for a gilded cage that had ultimately left him empty and alone. The weight of his mistakes pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. The road to redemption, he realized, would be long and arduous. The silence remained, heavy with unspoken words and unspoken promises, a stark reminder of the immense gulf he had created, a gap he now desperately sought to bridge. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the meticulously manicured lawn. Julian watched his sons from the patio, their laughter a jarring counterpoint to the turmoil within him. He'd brought them a small, intricately carved wooden train, a feeble attempt at bridging the chasm between them. It lay untouched, abandoned amidst a scattering of other toys. He saw Isabella watching him from the kitchen window, her expression unreadable. The distance between them felt vast, an ocean of unspoken words and unhealed wounds. He longed to cross it, to reach her, but the fear of rejection held him back, a heavy anchor binding his limbs. They seem happy," he finally managed, his voice a hesitant whisper that was swallowed by the afternoon breeze. Isabella emerged, carrying a tray laden with tea and freshly baked scones. She placed it on a small table between them, her movements precise, devoid of warmth. The scent of lavender, a comforting scent that seemed to cling to her, did little to soften the icy reserve in her eyes. "They are," she replied, her voice calm, almost too calm. "They've learned to build their own happiness." Her gaze drifted to the abandoned train, a hint of sadness fleeting across her face. "Just like they learned to build their own castles." Julian picked up a scone, the crumbly texture oddly comforting. He chewed slowly, the taste of sweetness doing little to ease the bitter taste in his mouth. He'd expected anger, fury even, but this quiet, controlled sadness was far more devastating. It spoke volumes of the resilience she'd had to cultivate, the strength she'd discovered within herself, a strength born from his abandonment. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some apology, some explanation, but the words caught in his throat. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, heavier than any burden he'd ever known. He'd spent his life climbing towards success, ignoring his moral compass, only to find himself at the precipice of a far greater challenge, redeeming himself in the eyes of the people he'd wronged most deeply. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant chirp of birds and the soft sounds of his sons playing nearby. His quest for redemption had just begun. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sprawling lawn, painting the manicured grass in hues of amber and gold. Julian sat awkwardly on a wrought iron bench, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth radiating from the sun. He watched his sons, 5-year-old Leo and his twin brother, Finn, building a magnificent sandcastle near the pool. Their small hands worked with surprising dexterity, their laughter echoing across the expansive garden. A pang of something akin to pride, a feeling both unfamiliar and intensely potent, pierced the thick shell of his self-imposed isolation. He glanced towards the French doors leading to the house. Isabella stood framed in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm interior light. Her profile, once so familiar and comforting, now held a quiet dignity that both captivated and intimidated him. He tried to approach her several times, his attempts met with a polite but firm distance. He felt like a stranger intruding on sacred ground. He cleared his throat, the sound thin and reedy. They're quite the architects, aren't they? His voice, even to his own ears, sounded stilted, unnatural. Isabella joined him, her footsteps light on the stone path. She sat a respectful distance away, the space between them a chasm that seemed to widen with every passing moment. They are, she replied, her voice calm, yet laced with an undercurrent of sadness that mirrored his own. The scent of lavender, her signature perfume, drifted towards him, a poignant reminder of a past he had so carelessly destroyed. I brought them a gift, Julian stammered, pulling a small, intricately carved wooden train from his briefcase. He offered it to Leo, who eyed it with suspicion before returning to his castle. The rejection stung, a small but sharp jab at his already bruised ego. Isabella sighed, a soft, melancholic sound that spoke volumes. They have everything they need, she said gently, her eyes betraying a flicker of compassion that belied her words. They have each other. Her gaze lingered on the boys, a profound tenderness softening her features. The resilience she'd cultivated in the face of his betrayal was breathtaking, both inspiring and deeply saddening. Julian felt a tightening in his chest, a familiar knot of guilt twisting in his stomach. He'd underestimated the strength of a woman scorned, the enduring power of a mother's love. His quest for redemption had only just begun, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that it would be the hardest battle he'd ever face. The afternoon's golden light began to fade, leaving behind the cool hues of twilight, a fitting metaphor for the long, arduous journey ahead. The mahogany desk gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of Julian's temporary office. The air hung thick with the scent of stale coffee and simmering resentment. He stared at the meticulously organized files detailing Serafina's treachery, each document a fresh stab to his already wounded pride. The crisp paper felt cold against his fingertips, a stark contrast to the burning shame in his gut. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the gesture betraying his inner turmoil. His phone buzzed, the jarring sound cutting through the suffocating silence. It was his lawyer, the terse message a chilling confirmation of his worst fears. Blackwood was moving in for the kill. The lawsuit, meticulously crafted by Serafina, was a masterpiece of legal maneuvering, designed to dismantle his empire piece by piece. He slammed the phone down, the sharp crack echoing in the cavernous room. The weight of his actions, the consequences of his betrayal, crashed down on him with renewed force. He hadn't just lost a mistress. He'd lost his reputation, his company, and any semblance of peace. The hollow ache in his chest was a constant reminder of his failings. He thought of Isabella, of the quiet dignity he'd witnessed in her eyes, the unwavering strength in her bearing. The image of his sons, building their sandcastle, flashed in his mind. A fierce, unexpected wave of longing washed over him, a desperate yearning for the life he'd thrown away. He hadn't just hurt Isabella. He'd robbed himself of the chance to know these remarkable children. The phone buzzed again. This time it was a different number, an unknown one. Hesitantly, he answered. A woman's voice, laced with cautious hope, spoke his name. Mr. Thorne? This is Detective Miller. We have some information regarding Ms. Serafina Moreau. It concerns evidence of blackmail and further evidence of her conspiracy with Mr. Blackwood. A sliver of hope, fragile yet persistent, pierced the darkness. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance to salvage something from the wreckage of his life. But even as the detective's words offered a glimmer of light, the shadow of his past deeds loomed large, a constant reminder of the steep price he'd yet to pay. The detective's words hung in the air, a fragile lifeline in the storm of Julian's despair. He felt the cold press of the mahogany desk against his skin, the scent of old paper and regret clinging to him like a shroud. The hope, tentative as a newborn's breath, was quickly shadowed by the enormity of his mistakes. He pictured Isabella's face, the quiet strength etched into her features, a stark contrast to the brittle veneer he'd always presented. He paced his temporary office, the harsh fluorescent lights reflecting off the polished floor, each step echoing the emptiness within him. His phone vibrated again, the insistent buzz a jarring counterpoint to the gnawing silence. It was his lawyer again, the brief message chillingly precise. Blackwood was tightening the noose. "He's accelerating the lawsuit," Julian muttered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying the turmoil churning beneath his carefully controlled exterior. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, crushing the last vestiges of his arrogance. He had built his empire on ambition and ruthlessness, and now it was crumbling under the weight of its own fragility. The image of his sons, their laughter echoing in his memory, was a sharp pang of regret. He'd denied them, abandoned them, and now the consequences were insurmountable. The yearning to know them, to be a part of their lives, was a raw, visceral ache. The longing twisted in his gut, a painful reminder of everything he'd lost. He sat heavily in his chair, the cold leather a stark reminder of his isolation. The detective's call offered a sliver of hope, a chance to fight back, but the damage was done. He'd alienated those he loved, betrayed those who trusted him, and the road to redemption, if there even was one, seemed impossibly long and arduous. He closed his eyes, the weight of his past actions pressing down, a crushing burden that only he could bear. The journey towards redemption had begun, a treacherous path paved with regret, but one he had to walk alone for now. The detective's words, a damning indictment of Serafina, hung heavy in the air. Julian stared at the worn photograph of his sons, their bright eyes mirroring a future he'd almost entirely missed. The mahogany desk felt cold and unforgiving beneath his elbows. He rubbed his tired eyes, the harsh fluorescent lights blurring his vision. "A mole," he whispered, the word tasting like bitter ash. Blackwood's insidious plan, orchestrated through Serafina's calculated deceit, had nearly destroyed him. The lawyer's call, a curt update on Blackwood's relentless legal assault, jolted him back to the present. The lawsuit was escalating, a financial tsunami threatening to engulf everything he'd built. He slammed his fist on the desk, the sharp sound echoing the rage simmering beneath his weary facade. He wasn't just battling Blackwood. He was wrestling with the ghost of his own mistakes, the specter of his abandoned family. The image of Isabella's quiet strength, her unwavering resilience, pierced through his self-pity. He'd underestimated her, dismissed her fragility as weakness. Now, he saw it as the quiet strength that had allowed her to not only survive but thrive in the face of his betrayal. The thought of approaching her, of facing her justified anger, filled him with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling slightly as he punched in her number. The ringing tone echoed in the suffocating silence of his temporary office, each ring a hammer blow against his guilt. It went to voicemail. The recorded message, polite but distant, was a chilling reminder of the chasm he'd created between himself and the woman he had wronged. The phone fell from his numb fingers, landing with a dull thud on the polished mahogany. He had to try, he knew this much. The road ahead was daunting, paved with regret, but this time, it was a journey he wouldn't walk alone. The fight for redemption had begun, not just for his business empire, but for the chance to reclaim his family, and most importantly, the chance to become the father he was never able to be. The detective's report lay open on his desk, a stark white rectangle against the dark mahogany. Each word, a cold slap in the face. Julian traced the elegant script with a shaking finger, the scent of old paper and stale coffee filling his senses. The betrayal ran deeper than he'd imagined. Serafina's calculated actions, a carefully woven tapestry of deceit, had unraveled his life, both professionally and personally. The weight of it pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket of guilt. He stared out the panoramic window, the city sprawling below like a glittering, indifferent beast. The muted hum of traffic faded into the background as a wave of nausea washed over him. He hadn't slept properly in days, his reflection staring back from the polished glass, gaunt, hollow-eyed, a shell of the man he once was. His phone buzzed, a jarring interruption. It was his lawyer, his voice a tight, controlled wire. Blackwood's countersuit is devastating, Julian. He's pulling out all the stops. Your reputation. It's hanging by a thread. The thread snapped. Julian slammed his fist on the desk, the sharp crack echoing the shattering of his carefully constructed world. The opulent office, once a symbol of success, now felt like a gilded cage. He was trapped, suffocating under the weight of his own making. But amidst the despair, a flicker of defiance ignited. He wouldn't surrender. Not to Blackwood, not to his own mistakes. He would fight. He had to fight. He picked up the photograph again, his fingers brushing against the smooth, glossy surface. The twins' smiling faces, so much like him, yet so utterly unknown, tugged at something deep inside him. A nascent feeling, fragile but insistent, bloomed in the barren landscape of his soul. Paternal love. It warred with the crushing weight of his guilt, but it was there, a tiny seed of hope pushing through the hardened earth. He had to reach them. He had to reach Isabella. The journey would be arduous, paved with regret and resistance, but it was a journey he was finally ready to undertake. The fight for redemption had begun. The news spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed of Julian Thorne's scandalous past, his betrayal, Serafina's treachery. The whispers followed him like shadows in boardrooms, on the streets, even in the hushed tones of his own opulent penthouse. The scent of expensive cologne couldn't mask the bitter stench of public humiliation. He found Serafina in her apartment, a sleek, minimalist space, a stark contrast to the chaos in his life. She sat perched on a designer sofa, a glass of something amber swirling in her hand, her expression as cold and calculating as ever. The air hummed with unspoken accusations. "You knew," Julian rasped, the words catching in his throat. The polished marble floor felt slick beneath his shoes, his reflection a distorted mockery in the glass coffee table. Serafina's lips curled into a humorless smile. "Knew what, Julian? That you were a fool easily manipulated? That your empire was built on sand? Blackwood offered me a better deal." Her voice was smooth, devoid of emotion, each syllable a tiny dagger. He lunged across the room, the carefully controlled rage shattering the fragile calm. He grabbed her arm, his fingers tightening, his knuckles white. "You destroyed everything." She laughed, a brittle, chilling sound. "You destroyed yourself, Julian. I merely expedited the process." She shrugged, the movement careless, dismissive. The amber liquid in her glass trembled slightly. He released her, the sudden emptiness a physical blow. He staggered back, the bitter taste of betrayal coating his tongue. The opulent setting, once a sanctuary, now felt like a suffocating tomb. He had been played, used, discarded. The reality crashed down, a wave of despair threatening to engulf him. He was left standing alone, amidst the ruins of his carefully constructed world. The silence punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a minimalist clock, each tick a relentless reminder of time running out. The fight for redemption was far from over. It had just begun, and it would be a brutal, unforgiving battle. The penthouse, usually a haven of serene luxury, felt claustrophobic. Julian stared out at the city lights, a million pinpricks of artificial brilliance mirroring the hollowness in his chest. He'd lost Serafina, his business was teetering, and the crushing weight of his past actions threatened to bury him alive. The expensive scotch in his hand tasted like ash. He picked up his phone, the cool glass a stark contrast to the burning shame within him. Isabella's number trembled on the screen. He hesitated, the fear of rejection a cold fist around his heart. He tried to contact her before. His attempts met with icy silence, with the sharp sting of unanswered calls. This time, something felt different. A desperate hope, fragile but persistent, flickered within him. He pressed the call button. The ringing tone echoed the frantic beat of his heart. It went to voicemail. The automated voice, smooth and impersonal, felt like a cruel mockery of his vulnerability. He hung up, the silence more deafening than the ringing had been. He slumped onto the plush sofa, the silk sinking beneath him, offering no comfort. The city lights blurred through his tears. The glittering facade of his success was shattered, revealing the raw, vulnerable man beneath. He was drowning in the consequences of his own choices, a self-made prisoner in his gilded cage. The betrayal stung, yes, but the deeper wound was the self-inflicted one, the abandonment of his wife and the disregard for the life he had so casually tossed aside. The image of his sons, fleeting but vivid, surfaced in his mind. Two small boys, their eyes shining with an intelligence beyond their years, their faces etched with a quiet resilience that both startled and humbled him. He hadn't deserved their forgiveness, yet the thought of them ignited a spark of hope amidst the ashes of his ruined life. A fragile seed of redemption, planted in the fertile ground of regret. He needed to do more than just beg forgiveness. He needed to earn it. He needed to prove to Isabella, and to himself, that he wasn't the man he had been. The path ahead was long and arduous, filled with challenges both personal and professional. But for the first time in a long time, Julian Thorne felt a flicker of determination, a stubborn refusal to surrender to the darkness that threatened to consume him. The fight had begun. The mahogany bar felt cold beneath Julian's elbows. The expensive whiskey, usually a bomb, tasted like bitter regret. He watched the city spread below, a glittering tapestry woven with his own failures. He tried calling Isabella again, the unanswered call a fresh wound. He needed to see her, to be with her, but the fear of her rejection paralyzed him. A low chuckle sliced through his thoughts. Serafina. She sat across the room, a vision in scarlet silk, her laughter as sharp as shattered glass. He'd thought she was his escape, his ticket to a life free of the stifling responsibility of his marriage. Now he saw her true face, a mask of cold ambition. She'd been Blackwood's pawn all along. The realization burned. "Enjoying the view, Julian?" she purred, her voice laced with the same cruel amusement that had once seduced him. He didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the swirling amber liquid in his glass. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. "It's quite a fall from grace," she continued, her tone dripping with contempt. "From billionaire playboy to what? A broken man begging for forgiveness." The words stung, but he refused to flinch. He'd faced worse. The loss of Isabella, the betrayal by Serafina, the looming threat of financial ruin. They were all less painful than the gnawing guilt he carried for abandoning his sons. He saw their faces, small and vulnerable, a potent counterpoint to the glittering superficiality of his current reality. He finally met her gaze, his own eyes unwavering. "You used me, Serafina. You and Blackwood." His voice was low, a dangerous rumble. "And you were so easily used," she retorted, her smile widening. "You were blinded by your own desires. You never saw past your own reflection." He slammed his glass down, the ice clinking harshly. The sound echoed the icy fury simmering within him. He wouldn't beg. He wouldn't plead. He would earn back what he had lost. He would earn Isabella's forgiveness. He would fight for his sons. The fight for redemption had begun, and he was ready. The city lights no longer represented hollowness, but the challenge ahead. He would rise above this. He had to. The news spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed of Julian Thorne's fall from grace, his affair with Serafina, her betrayal, and the devastating truth about his abandoned sons. The opulent penthouse, once a symbol of his success, felt like a gilded cage. The scent of expensive perfume, once alluring, now clung to the air like a suffocating shroud. He paced, the polished marble floor cold beneath his bare feet, the rhythmic thud a counterpoint to the frantic beat of his heart. A knock. His lawyer, Mr. Davies, stood in the doorway, his face etched with professional concern. "The papers are relentless, Julian. Blackwood's lawyers are circling." Julian nodded, his gaze fixed on a framed photograph of Isabella, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. The image felt like a punch to the gut. "I need to see her," Julian said, his voice hoarse. "I need to talk to my sons." Davies hesitated. "She hasn't responded to your attempts to contact her, Julian. This will take time, patience, understanding." The next day, Julian stood before Isabella's modest home, a stark contrast to his own opulent surroundings. The air smelled of freshly baked bread and honeysuckle, a comforting scent that both calmed and stung him. He rang the doorbell, his hand trembling. A young boy with Isabella's eyes opened the door, his gaze cautious. "Who are you?" "I'm your father, Julian Thorne," he stammered, the words catching in his throat. The boy's eyes widened. He didn't recognize him. The door clicked shut. His rejection was final, complete. The silence was deafening, a stark echo of the chasm he'd created. He felt a wave of despair wash over him, the cold reality of his actions solidifying. The fight for redemption was just beginning, and it would be harder than he had ever imagined. The glittering city lights seemed to mock him, while the quiet hum of Isabella's suburban street felt like a constant reminder of his profound failure. The chipped paint on Isabella's front door seemed to mirror the cracks in Julian's carefully constructed world. He stood there, the scent of honeysuckle a cruel juxtaposition to the sterile aroma of his penthouse. He rang the bell again, the sound echoing the frantic rhythm of his heart. This time, Isabella opened the door. Her eyes, once bright with youthful love, now held a guarded stillness, a chilling reflection of his own shattered reflection. "Julian," she said, her voice devoid of warmth, each syllable a carefully measured stone. He fumbled for words, the carefully rehearsed speech dissolving into a choked whisper. "Isabella, I need to explain." "Explain?" she echoed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. 5 years of silence, 5 years of deliberate absence, and now you want to explain? Her gaze swept over him, taking in the expensive suit, the perfectly styled hair, the haunted eyes that betrayed the veneer of success. "You abandoned me, Julian. You abandoned us." The unspoken accusation hung heavy in the air, thick with the scent of unspoken pain. He saw his sons in the background, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. He tried to speak, to reach out, but her icy gaze held him at bay. He saw a flash of pain in her eyes before they hardened again, a pain mirrored in the way she clutched a small wooden toy car, his son's toy car. "I know I hurt you," he began, his voice raw with emotion. "I was a fool, a selfish monster, but I want to be a part of their lives. I want to be their father." The silence stretched, broken only by the soft chirping of crickets. The weight of his words, the years of neglect, hung heavily between them. Isabella didn't speak for a long time, her gaze unwavering. Finally, a single tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a clean trail through the controlled mask she'd crafted. "It's not that simple, Julian," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You can't just reappear and expect a forgiveness. It takes more than words." She turned her back slightly, her shoulders trembling. "It will take more than your money, your apologies, your hollow assurances." Her voice broke, the dam of years-long containment finally giving way. "They need more than an explanation, Julian. They need a father. And that, I don't know if you can ever be." The door closed gently, leaving Julian outside, the scent of honeysuckle now a suffocating reminder of the chasm between them. The road to redemption was long, arduous, and filled with steep climbs and winding roads. The journey had begun, but he still hadn't reached the first milestone. The lawyer's words hung in the air, sharp and precise, like shards of glass. "The trust fund, it's substantial, more than you could ever imagine." Julian stared, the mahogany of his study blurring at the edges. He'd lost everything except the hollow shell of his reputation. And now this, a fortune for his sons. His sons. The thought, once a distant, painful echo, now resonated with a raw, unsettling intensity. He felt a tremor, not of fear, but of something akin to hope. He drove to Isabella's house, the familiar ache in his chest a dull roar. The house, modest compared to his mansion, held a quiet dignity. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorbell, the weight of 5 years pressing down on him. He imagined Isabella's reaction, the cold fury, the justified scorn. He rang the bell, The sound was swallowed by the sudden, overwhelming scent of freshly baked bread and something else, lavender, perhaps. He hadn't realized how much he missed these simple, comforting aromas. Isabella opened the door, her eyes widening slightly, before settling into that same guarded stillness. The 5 years were etched onto her face, not in lines of age, but in the quiet strength that had blossomed in their absence. "Julian," she said, her voice calm, devoid of the theatrical anger he'd expected. The calmness was more frightening. It spoke of a peace he'd destroyed, a serenity he'd never deserved. "Isabella," he started, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I know I—" She held up a hand, stopping him. "I don't want your apologies, Julian. I don't need them. I need you to understand that what you did was unforgivable." The quiet intensity of her gaze pierced him. He saw a glimpse of the woman he'd loved, now tempered by sorrow and resilience. He looked past her, catching sight of 2 small boys engrossed in a game of building blocks. They were his sons. His heart clenched. They were his. The realization was both breathtaking and agonizing. He longed to reach out, to touch them, but fear kept him rooted to the spot. They're remarkable," he finally managed, his voice barely a breath. Isabella's gaze softened, ever so slightly, a flicker of something that might have been compassion crossing her face. "Yes," she murmured, "they are." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words, with years of pain and regret. But in the silence, a new seed was sown, a tentative beginning to something else, something that could maybe, just maybe, bloom into forgiveness. The road was long, but he saw, finally, the first tentative steps towards redemption. The scent of lavender and wood smoke hung in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile perfume of Julian's opulent mansion. Isabella's home, though modest, felt warmer, more alive. He watched his sons, their laughter echoing softly, a melody he'd never known he craved. He felt the familiar sting of regret, a heavy weight in his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer the apologies that felt so inadequate, so pathetic in the face of her quiet dignity. "They're like you," he finally stammered, the words catching in his throat. Isabella turned, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, before a carefully constructed mask of composure settled back in place. "In what way, Julian?" Her voice was soft, almost gentle, yet the icy edge remained. He could see the scars not only on her face, but in the way she held herself, the careful precision of her movements. He gestured towards the boys, lost in their playful world of building blocks. "Their resilience, their strength, it's remarkable." He felt a lump forming in his throat, a sudden rush of emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Isabella's gaze softened imperceptibly. "They are strong," she agreed, her voice husky. "They've had to be." A long silence stretched between them, filled only with the soft clinking of blocks and the rustle of leaves outside. The unspoken accusations hung heavy in the air, a palpable weight between them. He saw the hurt in her eyes, the years of pain and loneliness etched into her features. The weight of his betrayal pressed upon him with renewed force. He wanted to reach out, to touch her, to somehow mend the gaping chasm he'd created. But he knew words wouldn't suffice. Actions, genuine and unwavering, were the only language she would understand now. He had a long way to go, a very long way, but for the first time in 5 years, he felt a spark of hope, fragile but persistent, like a tiny flame flickering in the darkness. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the meticulously manicured lawn. Julian, awkwardly perched on a weathered wooden bench, watched Isabella tend her herb garden. The scent of rosemary and thyme mingled with the earthy smell of damp soil, a fragrance far removed from the sterile elegance of his own world. He cleared his throat, the sound brittle and hesitant. "Isabella, Isabella straightened, her movements precise, almost mechanical. She didn't look at him. "I'm listening, Julian." Her voice was flat, devoid of warmth. The years hadn't softened the edges of her anger, but instead had carved them deeper, sharper. He swallowed, the lump in his throat refusing to budge. He'd rehearsed this countless times, crafting eloquent apologies, heartfelt confessions. But the words seemed to evaporate the moment they neared his lips. "I know apologies are insufficient," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "But I want you to know." She finally turned, her gaze piercing, unwavering. The subtle tremor in her hands betrayed her carefully maintained composure. "You want me to know what, Julian? That you regret abandoning me, pregnant and alone? That you regret the pain you inflicted? That you regret destroying my life?" Each word was a carefully aimed dart, hitting its mark with unnerving precision. He flinched under her scrutiny. The polished veneer of his billionaire persona cracked, revealing the raw, vulnerable man beneath. He looked at his sons, their laughter echoing faintly from the nearby swing set, a painful reminder of his absence. "I regret it all, Isabella. Every single thing." His voice cracked, betraying the depth of his remorse. The weight of his past actions bore down on him, suffocating him. He wanted to plead, to beg for forgiveness, but the words wouldn't come. He could only offer her the silent testimony of his remorse, etched in the lines of his face, the tremor in his hands. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the darkness of his past. He knew he had a long way to go to earn back her trust, a journey fraught with challenges and uncertainties. But as he watched Isabella's gaze soften ever so slightly, a flicker of hope ignited within him. It was a fragile flame, easily extinguished, yet in that moment, it was enough. The following weeks were a blur of frantic activity. Julian, fueled by a desperate need to atone, channeled his considerable resources into improving Isabella's life. He discreetly arranged for renovations on her family's aging home, replacing leaky roofs and cracked foundations with quiet efficiency. New appliances hummed quietly in the updated kitchen, a stark contrast to the worn-out ones Isabella had struggled with for years. The children, initially wary, were charmed by the sudden influx of toys, carefully selected to match their individual interests. The scent of freshly baked cookies, a rare treat in their previous life, now filled the house regularly, courtesy of a hired chef Julian had insisted upon. One evening, while the twins were asleep, Julian found Isabella in the garden, her hands gently cradling a delicate rose. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine. He stood silently for a moment, watching her, the fragility of her beauty striking him anew. He hadn't noticed before, buried under layers of his own self-absorption, the subtle strength in her posture, the quiet dignity in her eyes. "The roses are thriving," he said softly, his voice husky with emotion. Isabella didn't turn. "They need tending, just like everything else," she replied, her voice low, almost a whisper. "I know I haven't been the best at tending to things," he admitted, his words catching in his throat. "But I intend to change that. For you. For them." She finally turned, her gaze searching his. The years had etched lines of weariness around her eyes, but there was also a resilience that had blossomed from the hardships she'd endured. He saw a flicker of something else, too, a hesitant spark of something that might be forgiveness. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and gently touched a stray strand of hair from her face. She didn't pull away. The simple gesture held more weight than any grand declaration could have. "I understand if you can't forgive me," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "But I want you to know that I will spend the rest of my life trying to earn your trust, to prove to you and to the boys that I'm worthy of being in your lives." The silence that followed wasn't heavy with anger, but with the quiet weight of unspoken emotions. The moon, a pale disk in the inky sky, cast long shadows across the garden, a silent witness to the beginning of a long, arduous journey towards healing. The scent of roses, now tinged with the promise of a new dawn, hung heavy in the air. The following weeks were a slow, deliberate dance of amends. Julian, humbled and acutely aware of his past failings, immersed himself in the minutiae of Isabella's life. He wasn't just writing checks. He was present, helping his sons build a Lego castle, reading bedtime stories with a gentleness he'd never known he possessed. The scent of sawdust and fresh paint clung to his expensive suit as he helped Isabella's brother repair the porch swing. The rhythmic squeak of the old would a counterpoint to the quiet hum of their shared effort. One afternoon, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The scent of roasting chicken, a simple, comforting aroma, filled the room. Isabella, her face etched with a weariness that tugged at Julian's heart, sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the rim of a chipped mug. He watched her, a familiar pang of guilt twisting in his gut. "The boys are different," she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. She didn't look at him. "Different how?" he asked, his voice low. "They're stronger," she said, finally meeting his gaze. "They've learned resilience I never knew I possessed." Her eyes, usually bright and full of life, held a shadow of the pain he had inflicted. He saw it reflected back at him in the polished surface of the old table. He reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers. He didn't touch her, not yet. He wasn't sure he deserved to. "I understand if you need time," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "All the time in the world." She nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and unhealed wounds. The warmth of the afternoon sun felt strangely cold. The scent of roasting chicken, once comforting, now felt heavy, a reminder of the simple domesticity he had so carelessly discarded. Yet, in the quiet weight of the moment, Julian felt a flicker of hope, a fragile flame struggling against the darkness of his past actions. A hope that perhaps, just perhaps, forgiveness might be possible. The journey was long and arduous, but he was determined to walk it, one hesitant step at a time. The following weeks blurred into a montage of quiet gestures. Julian helping Isabella's brother repair the dilapidated shed, the scent of pine and old wood clinging to his clothes. Reading bedtime stories to the twins, their small hands clutching his, a stark contrast to the icy detachment of his past. He learned to cook, his clumsy attempts at scrambled eggs eliciting giggles from the boys, a sound sweeter than any symphony he'd ever heard. He even attempted to braid Leo's unruly curls, a task that ended in a tangle of hair and frustrated sighs, but a shared laugh nonetheless. One evening, the twins, now 5, sat perched on the worn sofa, engrossed in a picture book. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Isabella, her face finally free of its constant worry lines, sat knitting, the rhythmic click of the needles a comforting backdrop to the children's hushed whispers. Julian watched them, a lump forming in his throat. This simple domesticity, this quiet joy, felt more precious than all his ill-gotten wealth. "Papa?" Leo said, looking up from his book, his eyes, the same startling blue as Isabella's, filled with an unexpected trust. "Will you tell us a story?" Julian hesitated, then nodded, the word catching in his throat. He began to weave a tale, his voice rough at first, then softening as he found his rhythm. The words flowed from him, not of power or conquest, but of love and loyalty, weaving a story of kindness and understanding. The twins listened, rapt, their small faces illuminated by the flickering firelight. Isabella, watching them, smiled, a genuine smile, one that reached her eyes and warmed her whole being. The next morning, a package arrived. Inside, a single, perfect red rose, a silent apology from a remorseful Serafina, a gesture that only underscored the chasm between Julian's past and the life he was slowly building. He didn't throw it away. Instead, he placed it carefully in a vase, a reminder of the thorns that had pricked him and the delicate blossom of forgiveness he was now cultivating. The journey was long, the scars deep, but in the quiet strength of Isabella's gaze and the innocent trust of his sons, Julian found a path towards redemption, one hesitant step at a time. The aroma of freshly baked bread mingled with the scent of wood smoke, a comforting contrast to the sterile scent of Julian's former life. He watched Isabella, her laughter a melody he'd almost forgotten, as she tossed a pancake playfully at Leo. The kitchen, once a symbol of his careless extravagance, now hummed with a gentle domesticity that filled him with a profound sense of peace. "More syrup, Papa?" 5-year-old Nico asked, his bright eyes mirroring the mischievous glint in his brother's. Julian, his heart swelling with a love he'd almost destroyed, squeezed a generous dollop of syrup onto Nico's pancake. "As much as your tiny heart desires," he replied, his voice husky with emotion. Later, amidst the scattered toys and storybooks, Julian sat beside Isabella. The fire crackled, painting dancing shadows on the walls. I don't know how to thank you," he began, his words clumsy and inadequate. Isabella's gaze, soft yet unwavering, met his. "You don't have to," she said quietly, her voice laced with a hint of the past pain, yet also with a newfound strength. "But showing up, actually being here, that's a start." He reached out, his fingers brushing hers. The contact sent a jolt of warmth through him, a silent acknowledgement of the miles they'd traveled, the bridges slowly rebuilding. He saw the lingering fear in her eyes, the faintest trace of doubt. He knew the road to forgiveness was long, but in this moment, shared in the flickering firelight, he felt a flicker of hope, a fragile yet persistent flame. The fight for his business, for his reputation, paled in comparison to the battle for her trust, a battle he was finally willing to fight with his whole being. The weight of his past actions pressed upon him, but the warmth of his present reality, the laughter of his sons, the quiet strength of Isabella, offered a glimmer of a future worth fighting for, a future where love could conquer even the deepest betrayals. The courtroom buzzed, a hive of whispered accusations and legal jargon. Julian, surrounded by the sterile scent of antiseptic and fear, felt the weight of 1,000 eyes upon him. Blackwood's lawyers, sleek and predatory, were dismantling his defense piece by piece. The rhythmic tapping of a judge's gavel echoed the relentless pounding of Julian's own heart. He glanced towards Isabella, seated in the spectator gallery, her expression unreadable, a fortress of quiet dignity. He saw Nico, clutching a small, worn teddy bear, his wide eyes mirroring the anxiety in the room. A sharp intake of breath escaped Isabella's lips as Blackwood's lead attorney presented damning evidence emails, meticulously forged documents, proving Julian's past unethical business practices, a past he thought long buried. The accusations hit him like a physical blow, each one a fresh wound on his already battered soul. He felt the familiar icy grip of despair tightening around his chest. The carefully constructed image of success, meticulously crafted over years, was crumbling before his very eyes. Later, in the hushed solitude of his temporary office, a stark contrast to his former opulent suite, Julian stared out at the city lights, a million glittering pinpricks of indifference. The city that had once mirrored his ambition now seemed to mock his fall from grace. He picked up a framed photograph of Isabella and the twins, a silent testament to his colossal mistakes. The boys' smiles, bright and untainted, were a stark reminder of the innocence he had nearly destroyed. He reached for his phone, the cool glass a stark contrast to the burning shame in his chest. He dialed Isabella's number, his finger trembling. The phone rang, each ring a hammer blow against his fragile resolve. Finally, she answered, her voice quiet, measured. "Julian," she said, the name devoid of any warmth. "What do you want?" He swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. I need to see them," he managed, his voice barely a whisper, choked with emotion. There was a long silence before she spoke again, her voice even quieter this time, a soft murmur barely audible. "Come tomorrow." The line went dead, leaving Julian alone with the ghosts of his past and a sliver of hope, fragile as a newborn's breath. The following morning, the sterile scent of the hospital waiting room did little to soothe Julian's frayed nerves. He fidgeted, the worn leather of his briefcase a constant, unwelcome texture against his fingertips. He'd chosen this simple, almost anonymous outfit, a stark contrast to his usual tailored suits, but the effort felt futile. Nothing could disguise the turmoil raging within him. He watched Nico, a miniature version of himself with Isabella's luminous eyes, building a tower of brightly colored blocks, his small hands surprisingly steady. The quiet intensity of the child's focus was unsettlingly similar to his own when he had been engrossed in a business deal, a stark reminder of the years wasted. Isabella arrived, her presence filling the room like a silent storm. She wore a simple dress, yet her grace was undeniable, radiating a quiet strength that both intimidated and captivated him. Her eyes, once soft and trusting, now held a guarded distance, a wall built brick by brick over years of heartbreak. "They're awake," she said, her voice even, devoid of warmth, yet strangely comforting in its controlled tone. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of unspoken emotions. He followed her, his footsteps hesitant, into a brightly lit room where his sons slept, small, peaceful figures in their cribs. He knelt beside Nico, his heart clenching. The boy's soft breath, the delicate flutter of his eyelashes, details he'd missed for 5 long years, surged through him, washing away years of self-deception. He reached out a trembling hand, gently touching Nico's cheek. The boy stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at Julian, his expression unreadable, then back at his mother. Isabella watched him, her gaze intense, filled with a mixture of anger, sadness, and a flicker of something else, uncertainty. "They don't know you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And I don't know if they ever will." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications, a challenge and a plea all at once. Julian knew then that earning their trust would be the hardest battle yet, a battle far more challenging than any corporate war. The mahogany of Blackwood's boardroom felt alien under Julian's hands. He'd traded his usual power suits for something less ostentatious, but the tailored shirt still felt like a suffocating cage. The scent of polished wood and expensive leather did nothing to calm the tremor in his hands. Blackwood, his nemesis, leaned back in his chair, a predatory gleam in his eyes. The air crackled with unspoken threats. "Your pathetic attempts at damage control are amusing," at her, seeing the strength in her eyes, the subtle softening around the edges of her mouth that hinted at a fragile hope. Isabella's expression softened, though only slightly. "Then show me, Julian. Show me this is different. Show me you've truly changed." The weight of those words settled upon him, heavy and inescapable. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I will. I'm not just fighting for Thorn Industries anymore, Isabella. I'm fighting for us, for our sons." The words hung in the air, charged with a sincerity that was both raw and vulnerable. A flicker of something akin to understanding, perhaps even forgiveness, passed over Isabella's face, fleeting but undeniable. The scent of lavender intensified, a whispered promise in the tense quiet of the boardroom. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in years, Julian felt a fragile tendril of hope, a beacon in the gathering storm. The fight would be fierce, but he was no longer alone. The crisp autumn air bit at Julian's cheeks as he stepped onto the balcony, the city lights a glittering tapestry below. The weight of Isabella's words, "Show me you've changed," pressed down on him, a physical burden. He'd presented his revised business plan, a radical departure from his past aggressive tactics, built on collaboration and ethical practices. The risk was immense, a gamble that could cost him everything. He sipped his scotch, the fiery liquid doing little to warm the chill that settled deep in his bones. He thought of his sons, their bright, inquisitive eyes, the way they clung to Isabella's hand, their small hands mirroring hers. The image was a stark contrast to the cold, calculating ambition that had once consumed him. His phone buzzed. It was his lawyer, the terse message flashing across the screen. Blackwood's counteroffer arrived. It was aggressive, a blatant attempt to bully him into submission. But Julian felt a strange calm. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it no longer held the paralyzing power it once had. Later that evening, he found Isabella in the children's room, reading a bedtime story. The warm glow of the lamplight illuminated her face, softening the lines etched by years of hardship and worry. The twins, nestled close, were already asleep, their soft breaths rising and falling in unison. The scene held a tenderness that tugged at his heart. "They're beautiful," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Isabella glanced up, her eyes searching his. "They are," she agreed, her voice quiet. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotions. The counteroffer. "It's brutal," he said, finally breaking the silence. Isabella nodded, her expression unreadable. "I've seen the document. It's a scorched earth strategy. Blackwood's intent is clear." He met her gaze directly. "I'm not going to back down. Not this time." A faint smile touched her lips. "I know," she said softly. "And I'm here, Julian. For you. For them." The words, spoken with a quiet strength, were a balm to his wounded soul. The scent of lavender hung in the air, a promise of a future he was finally ready to fight for. The battle was far from over, but this time he wasn't fighting alone. The hope, once a fragile flicker, burned brighter now, a steady flame against the gathering storm. The next morning, Isabella woke to the insistent chirping of birds. A sound usually soothing, today felt jarring. Sunlight streamed through the gap in the curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. Blackwood's relentless attacks weren't just business. They were personal, a calculated assault designed to break Julian. But Julian's new strategy, a risky gamble on collaboration, was already showing some unexpected results. She found him in the kitchen, hunched over a laptop, the screen's glow reflecting in his tired eyes. The scent of strong coffee hung heavy in the air. He looked up as she entered, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and grim determination. "Anything?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. He shook his head. "Blackwood's tightening the noose, but there are cracks. Smaller companies, ones he'd previously crushed, are starting to side with us. They see a different Julian Thorne." A flicker of hope, fragile but persistent, ignited within her. She poured herself a cup of coffee, the warmth a small comfort against the lingering chill of uncertainty. "It's not just about the business, is it?" she said softly, her gaze meeting his. He sighed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "No, it's about proving to you, to myself, that I've changed, that I'm not the man who walked away." The words hung between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken regrets and fragile hopes. The boys, still asleep, were a silent testament to the life they'd built together, a life he'd almost destroyed. His gaze softened, his eyes lingering on a framed photo of the twins, their chubby cheeks and gummy grins a poignant reminder of his lost time. The battle wasn't over, far from it. But in the shared quiet of the kitchen, amidst the scent of coffee and the promise of a new dawn, a fragile sense of unity emerged, a bond forged in hardship, strengthened by shared purpose, and fueled by the quiet hope of a future that, despite the odds, felt finally within reach. The mahogany boardroom felt colder than usual, the polished surface reflecting the grim set of Julian's jaw. He stared at the complex financial projections, the numbers blurring into a meaningless jumble. The air hung thick with the scent of expensive leather and unspoken tension. Blackwood's relentless assault was crippling, each blow meticulously aimed to exploit Julian's vulnerabilities. He felt the weight of his past mistakes pressing down, a suffocating burden. A sharp rap on the door startled him. His assistant, Sarah, entered, her expression grave. "Mr. Thorne, there's a proposition from Blackwood. It's unconventional." Julian leaned back, the worn leather of his chair creaking under his weight. Unconventional how? He felt a familiar knot of dread tightening in his chest. He'd expected more blatant attacks, not this subtle shift. Sarah hesitated. "He's offering a merger, not a hostile takeover, a partnership." She handed him a document, the crisp paper a stark contrast to the turmoil swirling in his gut. The proposal was breathtaking in its audacity. Blackwood wasn't just offering a merger. He was offering a way out, a chance to consolidate, to rebuild. But at what cost? The details were carefully worded, obscuring the true implications. Julian felt a chill crawl down his spine. It felt like a trap, intricately woven, designed to bind him further to Blackwood's control. The smell of the old leather intensified, suddenly suffocating him. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture reflecting his inner turmoil. This wasn't just a business decision. It was a moral one. Accepting Blackwood's offer would mean compromising his newly found ethical stance, betraying the trust he was so painstakingly trying to rebuild with Isabella and his sons. The weight of that possibility pressed down on him, heavy and inescapable. He looked at the document, the elegant script mocking his internal struggle. He could almost taste the bitterness of defeat. Would he sacrifice his integrity, his future, to save his company? Or would he risk everything, trusting his instincts and the fragile hope for redemption that was finally within his grasp? The choice hung in the balance, heavy and terrifying. The silence in the room throbbed with the unspoken weight of his decision. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a countdown, each tick a hammer blow against the fragile structure of his future. The mahogany gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, reflecting Julian's haggard face. The silence in his opulent office was broken only by the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his pen against the proposal. Blackwood's offer, a seemingly generous merger, felt like a venomous serpent coiled around his ambition. He could almost smell the deceit, a cloying sweetness masking a bitter poison. Sarah, his ever-loyal assistant, stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the city's glittering lights. "It's a gamble, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice soft but firm. "A high-stakes gamble." Julian ran a hand through his thinning hair, the gesture betraying his exhaustion. "A gamble I might not be able to afford," he murmured, his voice rough with unshed tears. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, each betrayal a heavy stone in his gut. He thought of Isabella's quiet dignity, his son's bright smiles, a stark contrast to the darkness that had consumed him. He reread Blackwood's proposal, the elegant script a mockery of his internal turmoil. He could almost hear Blackwood's smug voice, a venomous whisper promising escape from his financial ruin. But at what price? To accept meant compromising everything he'd fought to reclaim his integrity, the nascent trust he was building with Isabella and his children. To refuse meant financial ruin, a complete collapse. The city lights blurred through his tears, a dizzying kaleidoscope of color and threat. He felt the familiar chill, the creeping ice of fear that had haunted him since his betrayal of Isabella. This wasn't just a business deal. It was a test, a brutal examination of his soul. He looked at Sarah, her concerned gaze a small beacon in the encroaching darkness. "I need time," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The decision, he knew, would define not only his business future but also the very essence of who he had become. The weight of the choice was almost unbearable, a crushing burden he carried alone in the cold, sterile light of his office. The ticking clock became a relentless drumbeat, each second a hammer blow to his already fragile resolve. The scent of old leather and expensive cigars clung to the air in Julian's study, a stark contrast to the crisp autumn air outside. He paced, the Persian rug muffling his restless steps. Blackwood's offer still lay on his desk, a pristine document mocking his internal chaos. The city lights, visible through the panoramic windows, glittered like a cruel, indifferent eye. Sarah, her face etched with concern, broke the silence. "Mr. Thorne, you haven't slept in days. You need to eat something." He waved a dismissive hand, his eyes bloodshot. "I don't have an appetite for compromise, Sarah. Not anymore." He ran a hand over his stubbled jaw, the exhaustion etched deep into his face. The memory of Isabella's quiet strength, the sight of his son's laughter, pierced the fog of his despair. He was fighting not just Blackwood, but the ghosts of his past, each one a sharp, relentless stab of guilt. He picked up the phone, the cool plastic a stark contrast to the burning turmoil within him. He dialed Isabella's number, his fingers trembling. He had offered her financial support, a feeble attempt at atonement. She had accepted, but her voice on the phone had remained distant, guarded. The call went to voicemail, the beep echoing his own inner emptiness. He sank into the leather chair, the plush comfort offering no solace. The weight of his decisions pressed down on him, the potential loss of his empire a secondary pain compared to the potential for further betrayal. This wasn't just about money. It was about proving to himself, to Isabella, to his sons, that he was capable of change. He had to choose between the glittering allure of power and the hard-won path of redemption. The decision, he knew, was about more than his business future. It was about the soul he was desperately trying to reclaim. The ticking clock seemed to amplify the silence, each second a deafening reminder of the choices that lay ahead. He had to choose, and he knew with a chilling certainty the cost of being wrong. The mahogany boardroom felt colder than the November rain lashing against the panoramic windows. Julian sat, the weight of Blackwood's offer, a partnership that would secure his empire but compromise his soul, pressing down. The scent of polished wood and expensive coffee did little to soothe the turmoil within. Sarah, his ever-loyal assistant, placed a steaming mug before him, her concern etched on her face. "Mr. Thorne, you haven't eaten in—" "I'm not hungry, Sarah," he interrupted, his voice a harsh rasp. The sleepless nights had etched shadows under his eyes, mirroring the darkness within. He stared at the offer, the elegant script a mockery of his internal struggle. He thought of Isabella's quiet dignity, the way his son's laughter used to fill their small apartment, a stark contrast to the echoing emptiness of his penthouse. Guilt, a relentless tide, threatened to drown him. Blackwood's offer was a lifeline, a way to reclaim what he'd lost. But at what cost? He picked up his phone, his fingers trembling. He tried to reach Isabella, his apologies a clumsy, inadequate attempt at atonement. Her voice, when he finally managed to speak to her, was distant, guarded. He hadn't even dared to mention the twins. The silence on the other end of the line felt like a chasm, the beep of the voicemail a cruel echo of his failure. He slammed the phone down, the jarring sound breaking the suffocating silence. He needed clarity, a path through this moral labyrinth. He rose, the movement slow and deliberate, his every step heavy with the burden of his past actions. He walked to the window, the city lights a blur through his tear-filled eyes. The rain beat against the glass, a rhythmic counterpoint to the frantic rhythm of his heart. He closed his eyes, the image of Isabella's face, pale but resolute, flashing before him. He had to choose, not for the empire, not for the power, but for them. For the chance at redemption, a chance he hadn't deserved but desperately craved. He knew in that moment the cost of being wrong was far greater than any business loss. The decision finally was clear. The boardroom, still echoing with the silent aftermath of Julian's decision, felt less like a battleground and more like a tomb. He'd rejected Blackwood's offer, the weight of that refusal settling heavily, a physical pressure against his chest. Sarah, her face etched with worry, approached, offering a hesitant smile. "I've canceled all your meetings for the day, sir. You need rest." Julian managed a weak nod, the exhaustion bone deep. He'd expected elation after his ethical choice, but instead, a hollow ache resided where triumph should have bloomed. The city outside, a swirling chaos of lights and rain, mirrored the tempest inside him. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture revealing the strain etched onto his features. "Thank you, Sarah," he murmured, his voice rough. "Just some water." The cool water felt strangely soothing against his parched throat. He watched Sarah leave, her silhouette a fleeting image of unwavering loyalty against the vast expanse of glass, a stark contrast to the cold indifference he'd encountered from Serafina. He thought of his sons. He imagined their faces, their small hands, their infectious laughter. A wave of fierce protectiveness washed over him, a stark contrast to the icy self-interest that had ruled his life for so long. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about atonement, about building something real, something lasting, in the face of his past mistakes. The phone buzzed. It was Isabella. His heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the answer button, a mix of hope and trepidation twisting in his gut. He took a deep breath, bracing himself for the unknown. He answered, his voice barely a whisper. Isabella? The silence on the other end was charged with unspoken emotions, a silent battle waged between hurt and possible forgiveness. He could almost hear her breathing, a delicate tremor in the otherwise quiet line. The next few seconds stretched into an eternity, a battle of wills waged across thousands of miles of hurt. Then, her voice, soft and low, but undeniably there, broke through the silence. Julian, she began, her voice tight with emotion. I need to talk. The air crackled with unspoken words, years of pain and betrayal suspended between them, a precarious bridge needing careful steps to cross. The sound of her voice, even laced with her restrained anger, was a lifeline, a fragile thread of hope in the vast emptiness of his past mistakes. The call ended with a whispered promise to talk later, leaving Julian hanging in the in-between. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windows, mirroring the confusion swirling within him. He rubbed his temples, the sharp ache a testament to the emotional roller coaster of the past few hours. He hadn't anticipated Isabella's voice, so fragile yet resolute, to stir such a potent cocktail of guilt and hope. He walked to the window, the cool glass a welcome contrast to the fever in his veins. Below, the city thrummed with a life he'd almost lost, a life of power and influence, now tainted by his own reckless actions. He saw the reflection of his weary face, the lines etched deep by stress and regret, a stark reminder of the price of his past indiscretions. Sarah entered, her concern etched on her face. Mr. Thorne, you really should rest, she said softly, placing a glass of water on his desk. The gentle clinking sound was oddly comforting. Thank you, Sarah, he murmured, his voice hoarse. Just a moment. He needed to gather his thoughts, to prepare himself for the conversation that would either shatter the fragile bridge he'd begun to build or pave a path towards redemption. He knew Isabella wouldn't easily forgive him. He didn't deserve it, but the glimmer of hope in her voice, the subtle shift in her tone, suggested a willingness to listen, a willingness to perhaps even consider reconciliation. He picked up his phone again, scrolling through recent messages. A text from Marcus Blackwood, laced with a bitter triumph, flashed on the screen. He deleted it unread. Blackwood's victory was hollow. Julian's true victory lay not in wealth or power, but in the potential for reconciliation with Isabella and his sons. That was a battle worth fighting, a battle he was finally ready to face. The weight of his past mistakes remained, a heavy cloak he couldn't yet shed. But within that weight, a seed of hope had sprouted, a tender shoot pushing its way through the hardened earth of his regret. The fight for redemption had just begun, but this time he was ready to fight with a renewed sense of purpose and a heart open to the possibility of forgiveness. The phone rang again. It was Isabella. His breath hitched. He answered. Isabella? He whispered, his heart pounding a hopeful rhythm against his ribs. Hello? Isabella said, her voice barely a whisper, a stark contrast to the roaring storm outside. Rain lashed against the window panes of Julian's penthouse, mirroring the tempest in his soul. He could hear the city groaning beneath the deluge, a symphony of urban unease that echoed his own inner turmoil. Isabella, he breathed, his voice thick with unshed tears. He could feel the weight of 5 years of silence pressing down on him, the chasm of his betrayal yawning between them. Silence stretched, taut and fragile as spun glass. He saw her, in his mind's eye, her face pale under the harsh glare of a hospital lamp, the exhaustion etched deep into her features, the fierce, quiet strength that had carried her through the years.